Hello, everyone. I'm Karen Rotabi-Casares, and I'm coming to you as a presentation or lecture about my experience developing not only programs, but thinking about the evaluation component of any program you develop. And I know for all of you, you're developing such a program. And it's really important that you start thinking about evaluation kind of as a parallel process as you think about developing the program. And that's the reason why reasonably early we have you start working on logic models. Um, so what I want to do is tell you about my own practice experience developing a program in my very first job with an MSW degree and how really honestly we didn't do that great of an evaluation and kind of my lessons learned there. And then the second part of this presentation, I'll tell you about a program in which we did have some evaluation built in and how part of that was kind of lessons learned for me. But one of the questions is, why did we not have a great evaluation built in for the first program? And I would tell you that um, honestly, my MSW program really didn't prepare me very well to develop an evaluation piece. And I think that that's one of the things about this class that I helped develop, or I led out developing. You may not appreciate that, but I led out developing this class with the program design element and the evaluation research piece. Having that in mind, what I kind of had a big hole in my knowledge and kind of figured out this program development and program design. And as I said, did not have a great understanding of evaluation research at that point. Um, and you are getting that kind of training in your parallel class and your research class. If you think about that, your research class having a parallel process to this class does also work you through logic models and how to think about evaluation research. So let's start. My very first job with my MSW degree. Um, was working for the United States Air Force. Now, I didn't have a uniform. I didn't salute. I was a civilian employee, and I happened to be working on an Air Force base in England, which was a lot of fun. I got to do some really interesting travel with that job, and so it was a really formative experience for me because the Air Force offered just so much training and opportunities for me at that point in the Air Force development of how they envisioned child protection and how to very specifically my area of that was how to prevent child abuse and neglect and how to also strengthen family systems and support families, especially couples, as married partners or people who you didn't have to be married, but a lot of people were, and how to support and strengthen those relationships so people were able to be in tune with each other, but also really doing their best at parenting and all the pieces that would be around family strengthening. So, my job was as a family advocacy outreach manager, and family advocacy program is the child protection program or child welfare program of all of the armed forces. And of course, I was saying that I was working for the Air Force. Now, that said, I just want to just give you a little sidebar here. When you're thinking about your first job coming out of this program, I just really encourage you to stretch yourself and find a job where you'll also have opportunity for a lot of training. I also had some great LCSWs who mentored me, which was just amazing. They all had far more than a decade of experience when I met them, and they really invested in me as a young social worker. So, and I didn't plan for that, but once I had that support, I realized how important it was. So, making sure that you have some seasoned social workers around you that are going to invest in you, but also a program, a job in which you get training experience that I did. Make these are questions that you need to have when you job interview. So anyway, that's a sidebar to this, but my very first job really stretched me, and part of it was this program development. So I was the outreach manager for the family advocacy program, and that meant that my job was to get out into the community and be a part of what was happening for families and supporting and strengthening them. And we had various programs. They're really life skills education programs that I was trained in. So I was trained to facilitate a parenting skills class, and it was kind of a parenting skills class in a box. The Air Force bought it as an intervention. They sent me to training to become a facilitator. The program was called Boys Town Common Sense Parenting. So I didn't develop that program. I just got trained for it, and it had a manual. It's a manualized intervention, a manualized program. So those are things that you can buy when you're out in your practice world. And this it was intervention tested. It had evaluation research and it had effect. And in fact, that program had been used very widely with military families, and a lot of the evaluation research had been carried out with military families. So that was a learning experience to be doing parenting skills program. And that particular intervention had a pre-test, post-test. The child behavior checklist, I believe, was what we were using. And so we were able to see whether or not child behaviors were changing from the beginning of the class, and then like the 12 sessions, and then the end of the class. So we were able to have some tests of what people were really skill set they were acquiring. Now, I again was not very well trained. So what that data meant to me, I was kind of struggling with that, but we did capture that data, and some other people did the analysis. The military has got a lot of research going on. So anyway, that was a pre-test, post-test example. Now, the other intervention, and this is where I want you to really focus in on this. The other intervention is called the Parenting Relationship Enhancement Prevention Relationship Enhancement Program. My apologies. And that program was developed kind of what you would call marriage enrichment. But again, you didn't have to be married, but it's for partnerships and how to be more effective at mainly at communication was the skill set in terms of life skills education. Now, again, this was a manualized program, and it had some testing this has been a while ago, and I don't recall what we were doing in terms of standardized testing. But the beautiful thing about the parenting skills program was that was an instrument that it had been heavily validated as a good test for child behavior. Now, the Prevention Relationship Enhancement Program, our evaluation research on that, and it's been a while, it was not as tight. So we didn't have, I believe, a standardized instrument for that. Anyway, but it was an intervention where people learn how to communicate effectively, but also, the importance of being there and supporting each other, and kind of just reinforcing all the things that we know about relationships. But the really important thing was teaching people about communication skills. And these are the things that we teach you in the social work program too. So reflective listening, speaking in a way that you're really listening and are being authentic, giving the person you're talking to an opportunity, maybe asking clarifying questions, which would be around reflective listening, like tell me more, help me understand. It sounds like you're saying those kinds of responses so that your partner feels heard. And when you think about what we know about successful partnerships, people do feel heard, and they feel there's an authenticity and an empathy of sorts that their partner provides for them as a safe place to be in terms of communicating. So that's what that intervention really focused on, with a heavy emphasis on the skill set of communication skills. So I was trained in that program too, another manualized program. And I was facilitating that, and I facilitated it a lot. And in that, I became pretty good. And so I knew that intervention well. And, I had this experience and I had that job for 3 years. So really had a very pretty deep experience, outreach, as I said, but executing interventions. So in that process, my learning experience there, my one of my next jobs, I really became quite committed to how can I continue to be involved in this kind of programming. And so when I went into some of my next work, I was asked with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society if I could help them with the same intervention, so the Prevention Relationship Enhancement Program, which had been developed specifically, it had been adapted for people, couples that were coping with multiple sclerosis, which is okay. So let's just say couples that are struggling with or challenged by disability, where one of the couple has, the problems that come with a serious, persistent health condition, which a health condition in which, for the most part, becomes more and more difficult over time, or more and more challenging physically over time. So helping couples adjust to one of the partners having a very serious health condition, which over time becomes more challenging, more difficult. So, what the National MS Society did was they approached the people who owned the Prevention Relationship Enhancement Program, the people who developed it. They happened to be at the University of Denver. The National MS Society, their headquarters was in Denver. So they partnered with the Prevention Relationship Enhancement Program, that's called PrEP. And they partnered with PrEP and they said, can we take this intervention and we adapt it to these kind of couples that we serve? And can we adapt it so that we overlay the information about what MS looks like over time, the kinds of challenges that people with MS report, so that it became tailorized to that population. And so I just want you to think about, they just overlaid some ideas, but they kept the same intervention, the intervention that had been tested. So I was facilitating, because they hired me because I had had so much experience. I was facilitating this program, and the core program was PrEP with the overlay of MS. So I did a fair amount of kind of weekend retreats with people that were coming through the MS Society. And again, I learned a lot about MS. It's when you work with couples and you spend the weekend with them, they tell you what the challenges are. They really kind of can express the kinds of difficulties that they are dealing with. So learned a lot. And of course, the MS Society had an evaluation research component. So, and it was pre-test, post-test. So I'm learning more and more about evaluation research. And part of this whole process was I started reflecting on the military experience that I had. And when I was working with the Air Force, we had taken these life skills programs. So the parenting skills program, the relationship enhancement program, but also some other life skills programming like stress management, assertiveness. We had a whole kind of package of life skills education programs for prevention of child abuse and neglect, prevention of, I mean, the relationship enhancement stuff, you can't say is prevention of divorce, but supporting and strengthening relationships. But also stress management, as I said, assertiveness, some other challenging skill sets for challenges. And so we had taken those programs and we started really being very effective at providing them in the community. And we very specifically, I was able to negotiate providing those programs in the workplace, so in the squadron, in terms of the Air Force. And we had so many people coming through that we actually called it the Community Outreach Prevention Program, which and we put an S in front of it, the Squadron Community Outreach Prevention Program. The acronym is SCOPE. So we had this program we called SCOPE, which was really just a re-delivery, a different delivery mechanism from what we were already doing when people were coming to us in a fixed location at a community center. We were deploying the intervention out into the workplace, and we just had huge numbers of people going through the program. And so they were taking these various life skills classes. And there was some incentivizing. If you take a certain amount of classes, the workplace rewarded them. So there were some reasons why some people went through it, but a lot of people were really pleased once they took a class or two. They were like, I want to take them all. So the question was, how did we test that with so many classes going on? Because theoretically, you really should have some life skills improvement. People becoming more effective. And what happened was is we did have a questionnaire at the beginning, at the end, so a pre-test, post-test, but we didn't have a standardized instrument, which on to some degree that was we there were other instruments that were being used. We could have done better, but we didn't have a standardized instrument. So what we were really collecting was kind of demographic, like who are you, what's your age, what's your race, ethnicity, and did you like it? And it's like a series of satisfaction questions. And let me just warn you about satisfaction questions. People tend to give you satisfaction about how they're feeling at that moment about the intervention, maybe the facilitator, and they're not telling you whether or not they've had a change in life skills. And the point of an intervention is change. So we had this information about people, but it wasn't particularly useful. So again, I'm thinking about this as I'm moving along, and I'm maturing as a social worker. And now I'm looking at the MS Society. They had a nice intervention built in. Sorry, they had a nice evaluation built into their intervention because they were funded by the federal government. During the George Bush administration, there was funding for supporting and strengthening families. So they had by kind of the grant requirement an evaluation research component. So I'm thinking more and more about that. And then fast forward after working with MS, and there's this overlay of disability information. I was approached by, when I was working in Virginia, and I was approached by the Wounded Warrior Program to further adapt the intervention to serve people were coming back from combat zones. And this was, Operation OEF, OIF, so Enduring Freedom, Iraq, Afghanistan returnees. And they were coming back with PTSD, and some of them had traumatic brain injury, which has some similarities for some people with MS, memory issues, etc. And so I was approached by the Wounded Warrior program of Virginia, and we put together, drawing on the disability element of MS Society, we put together program all the core components of everything I've been telling you so far, in terms of the prep program. And we overlaid the challenges of coming back home with, varying kind of levels of disability, but also just adjustment, mental health, depression, PTSD, and we delivered a weekend program. So we provided veterans and their partners with an opportunity to stay in a nice hotel, be fed well, be given opportunity to just spend some time together on a Saturday night without their kids because children were not invited. We did provide money for childcare for people who needed it. And it was a weekend program. And just as an interesting aside to all of this, we did charge people to participate. I believe we charged $50 per couple to participate. And I'm wondering if anybody that I'm speaking to right now understands why we did that. We did it because when people pay, they tend to value something more and they tend to show up. So we did charge people to participate in the Wounded Warrior program, which was different from those other two that I've given you as an example. But a little secret was if we knew that somebody was really financially challenged, we did let them come without the payment. But we were trying to make sure that people were really invested in coming because they were coming from all over the state. We were using a really nice hotel, so it was really kind of a weekend getaway, especially because we made it clear that the kids weren't invited. So we provided that program. I've already described it. And we did build in some pre-test, post-test that was appropriate. And so I'm learning as a social worker about how to be more effective in evaluation research to make sure that your program has effect. Is it really making a difference? Are you really developing a change program, a change intervention? So that's what you need to be thinking about when you're developing your program is, and as I said, parallel process. So one of the things that we did do that was really interesting was we asked people about themselves and then about, whether or not the program had been meaningful to them. And I have a presentation on that, and which I'm going to switch to in a minute. But this presentation was related to asking the spouses about kind of what they were experiencing and then how the program was useful to them. So this was part of our evaluation research. And just as another interesting aside is I did use MSW students as research assistants. They participated in the intervention, and you'll see a little bit of that in this presentation. They helped me out as I was the lead facilitator, but also they were kind of learning the intervention. So I did have a whole student component to this because at this point I was a faculty member of social work at Virginia Commonwealth University. So that said, let me start with the presentation. It's got some really interesting feedback from our participants, and I will go through that. It won't be too long, but it'll give you some opportunities to be thinking about how to maybe evaluate for your own program. And this is a qualitative research example, just so you know. And it has its challenges in terms of its quality, in terms of looking at real skill building, but it does ask people around how they felt about the program. Again, there's some satisfaction elements, but we asked deeper questions and just did you like it? We asked some deeper questions. So let's have a look at what we did. I'll be pulling up a PowerPoint, and here we go. So we called well we had this program which was quite uh similar to the MS program, but we had a stronger emphasis on traumatic brain injury and PTSD. And then what it became very clear to me, and something I really care about, if you've taken my classes, you'll know that I'm really committed to social support theory. I think that social workers should be working their way out of a job by helping people, getting people linked to each other that have similar problems, similar issues, and mutual aid. So, um, you'll see that social support, which is a theory from your human behavior social environment, how social support is built into how I conceptualize what we experienced with these couples. Again, couples don't have to be married, but for the most part, they were. And we did a very intensive literature review, which is what something that you're required to do. And we looked at what military families are experiencing post-combat. There's a whole body of literature on that, and what the challenges are post-combat. And then we also had the literature on marriage enrichment or relationship enhancement programs, and how whether they were effective or not. And they do have efficacy, especially the one we were using. We looked at the research around PTSD and traumatic brain injuries, specifically with an emphasis on veterans. We looked at the health consequences on spouses or significant others. So this is secondary trauma, and there's definitely evidence of secondary trauma with people coming back post-combat and their partners. And then there was a little bit of literature on the MS Society adaptation in terms of efficacy. There was one or two publications. So these are the areas that we developed around our literature review. And you need to be thinking about kind of the multi-dimensional pieces in the literature review that you'll be doing. Now, as I said, I had a strong commitment to social support. So there's emotional support. That's obvious what that is. Appraisal support is when you compare yourself to somebody else, which is really the whole mutual aid piece. When you're sitting together, maybe in group work, and you hear other people sharing their stories. So making some comparison to other people. Then there's informational support, which is obvious. And then instrumental support is, you know, kind of a question might be, do you have somebody in your life that you could go to for a $20 loan or an end of the month loan because you're short? Is there somebody who would give you a ride, maybe to the doctor if your car was broken down? Instrumental support is really tangible support. So we were asking questions, and so we developed our intervention evaluation around some of these ideas of social support. So this was a theory informed intervention in terms of our questions, which is important if you can really build in theory as a justification for how you're proceeding with your intervention evaluation plan. It's always good practice to have some theory. Just clearly, I don't need to remediate you all in what PTSD is. I assume that you have some sense of it. But one of the things that we did find in the literature is that military families, and especially military members or veterans, really can struggle with or are confronted with stigma. So if I admit that I have a problem, I'm not such a great warrior. And so in my own mind, that's not true. That's a false belief. But if I'm having mental health challenges, am I really ready for combat? If I come home as someone who's really damaged, and the stigma around looking to or acquiring some social service support or support from other people. And so people with PTSD, that stigmatized experience, they tend to be, according to the literature, less knowledgeable about the care options and have more negative perceptions about accessibility, eligibility, and delivery of services. Now, we found that from our literature review. So that was important to know because we definitely knew we were going to have PTSD related challenges in this particular population we were serving. And then we called the intervention the Mission Healthy Relationships Program, which the acronym is MHR. And it was community-based, highly accessible intervention. As I already said, it was a weekend retreat format. We used a really nice hotel with great food. We worked with the VA hospital to encourage referrals, and so that this was a community-based health and mental health opportunity. There were no medical records, and that matters because military members do not want medical records kept on them generally because they've had this whole experience of if I get too significant of a diagnosis, I'm not a ready warrior. So we had no medical records, and this was a real strength of the intervention. Now, Wounded Warrior also, as a program, referred people into this. So between the VA hospital and the Wounded Warrior program, we did pretty well with turnout. As a matter of fact, we had to kind of wait list people to come. So we'll talk a little bit about how many sessions, how many weekends we did in order to test this intervention. Now, really quickly, we did screening because we did not want to have couples that were seriously had such serious conflict in their relationship. An intervention like a retreat for couples was not really appropriate for them. That doesn't mean that they couldn't eventually be appropriate for them, because we recognize that some couples were so conflicted they really needed counseling first, and then consider the weekend retreat. So we did set aside funds that for couples that were identified for needs for counseling. So that was an alternative to the intervention or a supplement to the intervention. And to us, that was an ethics issue. We recognized that once we identified a couple that could use we thought could use the program, and then we realized they were too conflicted right now. We really needed to give them something. So there was funds set aside to cover marriage or couples counseling. So that's the ethical dimensions that we have to think about these programs that we develop. So it's a communication intervention, just like I have explained the various places where I have executed as a facilitator this couples communication intervention. And so just to look at the bullets on the left, we help people recognize common communication problems and ways to correct them, how to think about becoming more effective around communication and the kinds of problems which are typical problems for anybody, people even not coming back from combat. And then we help people understand that we have different styles for problem solving. Some people really want to jump to problem solving as fast as possible without hearing their partner out. And that's actually a problem for the most part. You want to give your partner a certain amount of time of being heard so that they feel that you're giving that empathy, you're giving that authenticity, you're giving that support before jump immediately into solving the problem. So and that can also fall in gender lines, that men can be really interested in solving problems quickly and women want to be heard more. So now, it's not true in every couple, but there were some gender dynamics for that. We wanted to make sure that people had a plan for de-escalating arguments and conflicts, so we had some training around that, kind of some prevention. You see this escalating, how do you de-escalate? Again, the communication skills for listening and speaking, so there's some reflective listening, and that actually was pretty serious part of the program. But also, how do you protect and repair relationships? So how do you preventatively protect? And then if you really have let's say you said something you shouldn't, how do you repair relationships and give your partner grace for repairing a relationship? So that was another area that we talked about. And then we wanted to give that mutual aid or appraisal support, the opportunity for our veterans and their partners to discuss the challenges and concerns that are very specific to combat return to veterans. So they could be thinking about how to strengthen their relationships. And then we talked about the renewed commitments to one another, and we had some exercises around that. And then again, the last bullet, learning effective strategies very specifically for military operational stress. So we call the program Mission Healthy Relationships, or MHR. And in order to test this program with this particular population, we had six retreats. We have 132 participants. So that would be what, just under 70 couples. And we collected 25 interviews as our part of our evaluation research, but you see the -2. That was two interviews that I threw out because they were just not high quality. Some of my students just didn't do a very good job on two interviews, so it ended up being that we analyzed 23 rather than 25. So just setting an engagement. You'll see here, and by the way, all of these couples signed a release for their pictures to be taken because we needed publicity pictures. So you'll see here the couple on the left. They are actually practicing active listening. So one's speaking and sharing their thoughts and what their needs are, or maybe problem solving. And we'd ask them to let's give us a really low stress, low conflict challenge. Like, I feel like I'm always taking out the garbage, you're not helping. And that's true for general housekeeping. And then the couple could talk through that. That might not be a really high conflict problem for the couple. So we would say, okay, find a low conflict issue. Don't go for the hard things yet, and just use this as an opportunity to do active listening and go back and forth. So this couple is doing that. The young woman on the left, who's leaning in, is one of my students who's giving them feedback. So we did have people going around the room and giving some feedback. Now, she didn't sit there the whole time. We kept it so there wasn't a lot of pressure on people, but we did give some in action feedback. And then this other couple on the right, I mean, you could tell they were really, they were the worried well. They were so into each other that they are looking at each other's answers on some workbook exercises and talking to each other. I mean, look at their body language. So we had some really easy couples, but I provide this picture because we did have a workbook. So we had a number of different exercises that they could fill out. I really like doing this. When we were first dating, these are some of the things we used to do that I wish we did more of now. And we would make sure that we suggested, look, make sure you try to do low cost suggestions to each other because, you know, just like any couples, dating can be expensive, and also continuing to do those kinds of activities as a married couple can be expensive. But if you remember, maybe a walk in the woods or go to the park and have a picnic, these are the cheap or free things, and don't forget those things. So they were maybe potentially this couple on the right could have been filling out that worksheet. What are the things that we do to feel close to each other? So we had the setting is, and these are round tables in a room. So maybe two or three couples sitting at the round tables, and then they would break out and maybe get a little bit more space from each other to do these exercises. So we had this evaluation research component. As I said, we had interview research, and this is really important. We did not do a pretest, but we did a post test, or our test was 6 to 8 weeks post intervention. And the question is, why 6 to 8 weeks out? And the answer is, I didn't want those satisfaction questions at the end of the weekend. They were liking us a lot. They were so happy with the weekend. It was so low cost, and they stayed in a beautiful hotel. So asking them at the end of the weekend would have not been the best measure. So we did follow-up research by telephone 6 to 8 weeks post-intervention. And again, there were some satisfaction questions. I said satisfaction questions can be a challenge, but there were some satisfaction questions. And we had my MSW students and one PhD student did these interviews. I could not do the interviews because desirability, because they had gotten to know me as a facilitator. For me to ask the questions would not have been effective because there would be like as I said, desirability. They would say, "Oh, it was great," because I was a facilitator. So I couldn't do those. So that's the reason why I used my students and got them engaged in a real evaluation research experience. We did have random sampling, but we having a difficulty getting to 25 interviews, which was the sample size that I was really shooting for. And so we did some convenience sampling in which we started going back to the roster. Okay, this couple was really great. They're probably easy to get a hold of and probably would respond well to being asked to do this. So we did some convenience sampling, and that adds its challenges to quality of sample, but we wanted to get up to 25. So we had some random and some convenient sampling. And then my students did verbatim transcription. So everything that was said was transcribed, and I had that for my analysis. We used a computer program called Atlas TI for analysis, and we had two different analysts identify themes separately. So myself and that PhD student that I was talking about, we each went and thought, okay, what are the themes here? And then we were compared, did we both get the same themes? So we were able to start building out how are we going to really measure what we saw here. So in qualitative research, it's kind of an emergent way of thinking about how to do your analysis. And then we definitely saw the thematics of social support theory. It was very clear, but that was an emergent piece. We weren't sure about that going in, but we found it. I mean, it was undeniable, and I'll show you some of our results in regards to that. So, what did participants say? You know, I don't want to read you these verbatims, but I'll give you the read. So this person's saying that, it's not so hard to communicate anymore. It's an automatic way we talk to each other now. He now turns the television off and stops what he's doing so we can talk. So here we have he's not distracted, he's really paying attention. It's not that I'm trying to juggle something else and talk to you. He's more focused on what I am saying. So this is a spouse or a partner who's saying, he's paying attention to me now. And he's making communication a priority. And that is something we talked about and really reinforced in the life skills training. So now we're seeing that just improve communication in general. And then mental health and communication. Um, this spouse is talking about her husband taking things personally, being depressed. And she says, you really have to talk to somebody different when they have depression. You don't want them to feel rejected or take it too personally. And she says, learning how to communicate in a safe way and not necessarily having to solve problems right then. So you don't have to move into problem solving immediately, just communicating and giving each other that empathy and authenticity and reflective listening is what she's talking about there. And then she pointed to the retreat saying it gave us the opportunity to talk face to face, to talk about how things were different for him and how he was feeling about being in the National Guard and getting out and going back to civilian life. So she's mentioning depression. So here we have some mental health and communication. Again, this is a very happy person. They're happy. They're saying that things have improved. Social support and isolation. Isolation can be a very serious and persistent problem for people who have PTSD and traumatic brain injury. So, the other piece that we found was the spouses, the partners, frequently hadn't met other partners or spouses. And so they found that the retreat was really good to meet other spouses that were dealing with similar things. So here you got that appraisal support. And this is actually a husband saying she didn't feel alone like she was alone in this previously. She didn't deal with other military spouses in the past. So the retreat was one of her first encounters with them. So this is an example of coming together for mutual aid and how that was important. Emotional support, being more effective at supporting each other as a couple. Um, she's talking here about how he quit his job last week, and we had a lot of practices with the couples meeting. So one of the areas that we reinforced was sometimes things are so serious that you need to have a couples meeting, that you sit down and it's very specifically and very intentionally a meeting. So she says, you don't get so frustrated with him easily and kind of step back and understand his point of view when it's a couples meeting and you're being so intentional. So this couple is talking, or she is talking about feeling emotionally close during stress and employment changes, and improved communication skills. And you can see why this is really important. This really tells us something about emotional support. Breakout groups, in terms of emotional support, we broke the veterans out in one group and the spouses out in another. And we just asked, what is going well? What are the challenges? And what would you like to report back to your husbands or wives, to the larger group? So we have mutual aid. You can see me there, leaning in. The gentleman that you can see facing the group, his name's Henry. Henry was a Vietnam vet and he was facilitating the group. Now, I could have facilitated the group as a social worker, but Henry was really so good. I just stepped back a lot and really listened. And it was quite a learning experience for me to listen to men that were coming back from combat. So, and there was one woman, the person on the right side, you can see the back of her head, that is a woman in the group. But for the most part, we had male combat veterans. So appraisal support, that mutual aid that you would have in those breakout groups, in this one, you have somebody saying, you hear from another spouse what the daily life is like for them, what then what the life is like being a military member. It helps understand the things the veterans are going through. We hear each other on a much bigger issues than they do. We say, wow, we can really fix ours. So we did have some kind of inspirational couples there that were talking pretty openly about how they had struggled, but they managed to kind of push through and how they were staying committed and really connected to each other through these challenges post combat. So here's somebody saying, I heard from other people, and wow, we can really fix ours. So appraisal support. Informational support, you can imagine we had a lot of information about referrals, what was available in the community, but also general awareness. What is PTSD? What does traumatic brain injury look like in terms of common challenges? And so this individual, and she was dual active, dual marriage, active duty. So both of them had served. And then she also had a vet son who had gone to Afghanistan. And she talked about how this experience is invaluable. And she says the awareness and knowledge to pass on to somebody else. And she was talking about passing on the information to her son and to continue also to help our relationship the way it is now, I would say, and also help my son for sure. The idea of passing along information to other veterans was a consistent theme throughout the retreat. And that's what you want. You want mutual aid, people helping each other, people saying, hey, at the VA hospital, they have this, that, or the other. And one of the things they were definitely referring or helping each other see was the support groups that were being offered for like PTSD at the VA hospital. So getting people connected to services and they were helping each other refer, not as social workers referring, but which we did, but each other, so referring each other. Um, so as I was saying, influencing future involvement in support groups. The woman veteran that I was telling you about, um, she said, I never wanted to go any group meetings. I never wanted to be a part of that, but I really needed to talk to someone. And when we broke off into groups, it really helped me see that, we can draw on the strength from other people who are really being, I guess, transparent. She talked about how the stigma of support groups, she was not going to them at the VA hospital, but after this weekend, she started to realize that they could be really helpful. So that was a major transformational thing for her personally. And I remember her and how she said that, and I thought, wow, this is really important work when you see people say, I want some more of the interventions that are available. So we did have some risk and disclosures, and I talked with my students. We did a little bit of training around if people disclose suicide ideation or a previous attempt, or people disclose domestic violence incidents. And then there was medication compliance. There's a lot of issues around medication compliance that the spouses reported back on and after their breakout group. Please take your medicine. But if people were disclosing these, risks to self or others, how did we respond to that? And we did have somebody who had attempted suicide in the group at one point. So, but it had already been addressed by the VA hospital. They had had some interventions. So, and it was long enough after, et cetera. So I made the assessment that we didn't have to seriously intervene. He was already getting support elsewhere. There were some domestic violence incidents, and I had to handle that and check in. Is this very recent? Do you feel unsafe now? The kinds of things that you would do. And so my students may have identified that, but I did the really kind of checking in and making sure. So we did have some protocol around that for quick assessment and referral. So there were some challenges that we had to be aware of in order to do this work, and I had my students trained, and then I was poised to intervene as necessary. You'd be surprised that there wasn't that much of a problem with these issues. Research and limitations. Okay, so this is something you need to be thinking about when you develop evaluations. So there's sample size, especially convenient sampling, which I talked about, desirability, which I talked about. It would have been better if we would have had multiple interviews over time. So maybe at 8 weeks, maybe at 12 weeks, maybe at 20 weeks. So you could, continue to measure. We did not have that. We only did the 6 to 8 week follow-up. And then with this size sample with qualitative research, you always have challenges around generalizability. It's promising information for developing future research. And, it was it was piloting the intervention anyway. So lots of evidence, promising opportunities to continue to tweak the intervention, tweak the evaluation plan. So, and we did not have a quantitative pre-test post-test. And I think that that was an opportunity lost reflecting on that again. But there were tons of lessons learned about partnerships with students, about storing the data, how to analyze the data, lots of things that I learned with my students that we as student and faculty member, as professor and student, we had an opportunity to out process and learn more about. So that's our major ideas. But just think about the implications here, the importance of supporting and strengthening spouses and couples, not just the veteran, but also recognition that social support is a critical element for well-being, resilience, and recovery. And that Virginia did adopt the program, and there was potential for replication elsewhere. And I remember it was a program in a box that we overlaid PTSD and TBI and post-combat challenges. We did have a major publication come from this, so we did contribute to the literature on this particular intervention. If there's any questions, unfortunately, I'm not there to answer them, but you should have some questions amongst yourselves about what was good or not so good about how we evaluated or what you learned about the intervention. You should always have questions at the end of such a presentation, and maybe that's something you can do as a group. That said, thank you very much. I know it was a little bit of a lengthy presentation, but I think it was worthwhile because you do need to be thinking about in parallel developing an a plan for your program. And I do encourage whenever possible to think about a standardized instrument because that's really strong because it's been tested already. And you don't have to develop the measure so much as just execute it. And so that's a lot easier for you. So, but if you're going to use a standardized instrument, that needs to be a part of your literature review. So that said, I am going to sign off and give you all my blessings to go forth. Uh, I'm sure you'll do well. And look at this as a great challenge to learn about evaluation research for your program development. So that said, I will turn it back over to your professors. Thank you.